Every second counts when justice closes in, and some criminals can't hide their fear or their rage. Their faces tell the story words never could. Watch the most vicious unalivers reacting to capital punishment. Stephen Lorenzo.
I cannot tell you how much what I hear from you infuriates me.
I know it does, I can tell.
Some crimes are impulsive, others are planned. In some cases, though, the violence is repeated until it becomes a pattern. In 2003, Stephen Lorenzo was living in Tampa, Florida, when he and his accomplice, Scott Schweikert, began targeting men at local bars. The approach was calculated. They would strike up conversations, gain trust, and invite the victims back to Lorenzo's home. Once inside, the victims were drugged using GHB, an illegal substance, leaving them disoriented and unable to resist. What followed was prolonged. Survivors later told investigators that they were restrained, assaulted, and held for hours. Some managed to escape and report what had happened. Others never made it out. In December 2003, two men, Jason Galehouse and Michael Wachholtz, were targeted in the same way. Both were drugged and attacked inside Lorenzo's home. Galehouse was unalived, and his body was later dismembered. His remains were scattered across multiple locations, and many were never recovered. Wachholtz was also unalived. After his passing, his body was cleaned, placed inside his car, and abandoned in a parking lot, where it was discovered weeks later. Investigators uncovered disturbing evidence. Lorenzo had taken photographs during and after the crimes, documenting the acts. This showed clear intent and planning. By 2005, Lorenzo had already been convicted of multiple counts of drugging and assaulting other victims, receiving a sentence that ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The trial came later, focused on the two victims who did not survive. In court, when asked why it happened, Lorenzo did not express remorse. He explained it as a decision. The victim could identify them, so they chose to silence him. That answer shaped everything that followed, leading the judge to move forward with sentencing. However, just before the judge was about to give his final sentence, Lorenzo raised his hand, and what followed chilled everyone.
So I'm asking you to give me the death sentence, because that'll be more comfortable for me to live out my lifetime. I know I can be on death row for about 10 or 15 years, which I think is crazy.
After Lorenzo asked to be euthanized, the judge finally ended the case. Aileen Wuornos.
Thank you. And probably see, I'll be up in heaven while y'all are rotting in hell.
Aileen Wuornos grew up in a world defined by instability and neglect. By the time she reached her early teenage years, she was already navigating life on the margins, struggling with the law and grappling with addiction. With no stable home to return to, she drifted across Florida, spending nights in motels, in wooded areas, and along lonely stretches of highway. Survival became her constant focus, and she eventually turned to the adult industry as a means of getting by, relying on her own wits to make it from day to day. In 1989, the trajectory of her life took a darker turn. What had once been a daily fight to survive evolved into a series of violent encounters. Wuornos began targeting men who picked her up. She would appear vulnerable, sometimes pretending to need a ride or asking for assistance. But once she was alone with them, she would produce a firearm, using it to fatally end their lives. Between 1989 and 1990, 7 men were found deceased in remote areas across Florida. Many had multiple wounds inflicted through firearms, and law enforcement quickly recognized the pattern, linking each case to the same perpetrator. Investigators noted a chilling consistency. Each incident involved calculated steps, luring the men, isolating them, and then using lethal force. Some victims were struck from behind, suggesting they had no chance to defend themselves. Others displayed signs of attempting to flee as they were harmed, underscoring the sudden and violent nature of the attacks. Despite her initial claims of self-defense when she was eventually apprehended in 1991, the mounting evidence told a starkly different story. Wuornos insisted that every man had posed a threat, yet the physical evidence and the circumstances surrounding each slaying contradicted her assertions. The case took a crucial turn when her partner, Tyria Moore, chose to cooperate with investigators. Moore's testimony provided critical insight into Wuornos' actions, leading to full confessions. Wuornos eventually admitted to the slayings, revealing that they were not impulsive or spontaneous acts but part of a repeated pattern of calculated decisions. By the time Wuornos stood in court, there could no longer be any question of what had occurred. These were not isolated incidents. They were a string of deliberate, premeditated actions, each with a carefully considered method. The trial moved toward its conclusion, culminating in the capital punishment phase. The gravity of the crimes and the methodical nature of her actions left the court with little room for leniency. Multiple capital punishment sentences were formally imposed, reflecting the severity of the offenses and the devastating impact on the victims' families. As the sentences were read aloud, Aileen Wuornos had no choice but to confront the reality of her punishment. Even so, she issued one final verbal remark.
May your wife and kids get raped.
I would ask that you would point to the public office.
A defiant act that punctuated a life marked by chaos, desperation, and violence. Tyrone Johnson. In 2006, 27-year-old Tyrone Johnson committed a shocking and calculated act of fatal violence against his girlfriend, Stephanie Willis, and her 10-year-old son, Ricky, inside their home. What began as a heated domestic argument escalated when Stephanie blamed Johnson for the recent suicide of his own son, pushing him past control.
She said, I see why your son killed himself like because you're
During a phone call with his father, Johnson deliberately targeted both his girlfriend and her child, leaving behind clear evidence of intent. Shell casings scattered across the rooms, blood marking the path of events, and bullet holes piercing the walls. Investigators confirmed that Ricky had not been merely caught in the chaos, but had been specifically pursued, making the act deeply premeditated and chilling. Prosecutors emphasized that these were not spontaneous acts of anger, but calculated decisions carried out with cold precision. The loss left the victim's family devastated, grappling with grief and trauma that would endure for years. Johnson attempted one final plea to shift blame onto a corrupt judicial system, expressing remorse and begging for mercy, but the court weighed the deliberate targeting of his victims and the severity of his actions.
the state knowing nothing about me would have you believe that before you was a vicious man who went hunting for human lives.
When the capital punishment sentence was pronounced, Tyrone Johnson had no choice but to accept the finality of justice after a series of tragic, preventable events that shocked his community and left a lasting mark of sorrow.
I sentence you to death.
Markeith Loyd. In 2017, 33-year-old Markeith Loyd fatally injured his former girlfriend, who was pregnant, and a responding police officer, Lieutenant Deborah Clayton, in Orlando, Florida. Loyd had initially slain his girlfriend while on the run from law enforcement, and approximately a month later, he crossed paths with Lieutenant Clayton in a Walmart. Surveillance and police reports confirmed that Loyd fired multiple rounds, fatally injuring the officer and creating a citywide manhunt. Authorities eventually cornered Loyd at his residence, using SWAT teams and infrared cameras to track him as he attempted to evade capture. Despite severe injuries sustained during his arrest, including the loss of his left eye, Loyd continued to display defiance and erratic behavior during court proceedings. His courtroom conduct included outbursts, tantrums, and threats, further demonstrating his disregard for the severity of his actions. Throughout the trial, Loyd presented himself as defensive, claiming his actions were reactions to perceived threats, though evidence indicated the slayings were deliberate. The jury, after reviewing the overwhelming proof of his culpability, recommended that he receive capital punishment. Judge oversight ensured that Loyd could not harm anyone else, and the court imposed the ultimate sentence. The community and families of the victims were left to confront the lasting emotional and psychological impact of his actions. Loyd's response to his sentencing, marked by shock and frustration, highlighted the final reckoning for a man whose actions had devastated a city. Mikuel Brady.
Yeah, God has pretty much convinced me that I'm supposed to be incarcerated. I don't know. If it was meant to happen, it would have happened on October 12th.
In October 2017, 30-year-old Mikuel Brady was already behind bars, serving a 24-year sentence for attacking a North Carolina state trooper with a firearm. But prison walls couldn't contain his ambition or his violence. Brady, along with 3 other inmates, plotted a daring escape from Pasquotank Correctional Institution. Using his access in the prison sewing plant, he armed himself and his accomplices with hammers, scissors, and any tool he could find. Security cameras later captured chilling footage of Brady in the moments before the attack. Calm and deliberate, he handed scissors to one accomplice and followed a prison worker down a back corridor. In minutes, chaos erupted. The inmates struck with lethal force, beating, and 4 prison employees, which resulted in slayings that left the facility reeling. During his trial, Brady remained unnervingly composed. Prosecutors painted him as the mastermind, orchestrating the attacks with calculated precision. On the stand, Brady admitted his focus was never on the victims but on escaping, showing no hint of remorse. Every step of the breakout revealed a methodical, chilling indifference to human life, leaving the jury little choice but to recommend the harshest penalty. When the capital punishment was handed down, Brady's reaction was a mirror of his courtroom persona, detached and unflinching. Frazier Glenn Cross. In April of 2014, 74-year-old Frazier Glenn Cross transformed a lifetime of deeply held white supremacist beliefs into violent action, opening fire at 2 Jewish centers in the Kansas City area. His attacks left 3 people unalived and several others injured, sending shockwaves through the community, before he ultimately surrendered hours later. Even in custody, Cross's surrender was marked by a torrent of shouting, threats, and an absolute refusal to express remorse for his actions. Choosing to represent himself during trial, even in custody, Cross's surrender was marked by a torrent of shouting, threats, and an absolute refusal to express remorse for his actions. Choosing to represent himself during trial, he turned each hearing into a display of defiance, speaking in grandiose terms and declaring that his actions were morally righteous in his warped worldview, daring jurors to impose capital punishment. His courtroom behavior was aggressive and theatrical, filled with interruptions, provocations, and repeated assertions that he would be rewarded by God for what he had done. Despite this chaotic performance, the court carefully documented the premeditated nature of Cross's attacks and the racial hatred that fueled them, ensuring that the full scope of his crimes was understood. When the final sentence was pronounced and Cross was condemned to capital punishment, he did not flinch, remaining defiant to the very end, as justice for his victims was formally upheld.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of capital murder as charged in count 1.
I think the fat lady just sang, "Seek high."
Austin Meyers.
If you choose for me to die, it's only going to cause more pain and suffering.
In 2013, 18-year-old Justin Back became the target of a horrifying plan orchestrated by 2 of his childhood friends, Timothy Mosley and Austin Meyers. What began as a scheme to steal cash from Justin's stepfather quickly escalated into a devastating tragedy. Mosley persuaded Meyers to help him break into Justin's home, presenting it as a quick and simple robbery, but their intentions darkened once they were inside. The 2 confronted Justin, and a violent struggle ensued. He was attacked repeatedly with a blade, ultimately restrained and asphyxiated, with every attempt to escape or plead for his life rendered futile against the overwhelming force of the 2 assailants. The case shocked the community and drew intense scrutiny in court. Mosley chose to cooperate with prosecutors, providing testimony against Meyers in exchange for a plea deal, accepting full responsibility and receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, his remorse standing in stark contrast to the cold calculation of his accomplice. Austin Meyers faced the full weight of justice, addressing Justin's family with words of regret and appealing to the jury to spare his life, arguing that his execution would inflict further suffering on innocent people rather than bring any sense of resolution. Despite his pleas, the court considered the calculated and premeditated nature of his actions, weighing the aggravating factors against any mitigating circumstances. The state's case prevailed, and Meyers was sentenced to capital punishment, making him the youngest person awaiting execution in Ohio. As the sentence was read, he remained outwardly emotionless, absorbing the enormity of his new reality with a chilling, detached stillness that reflected the finality of the court's decision.
The court finds that the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the aggravating circumstance outweighs the mitigating factor. Therefore, the sentence of death shall be imposed upon Austin Gregory Meyers on the charge of aggravated murder.
Luis Bracamontes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please step out of the hallway.
Luis Bracamontes, an illegal immigrant from Mexico, sparked nationwide outrage after a violent crime spree in California in 2014. The spree began in a motel parking lot, where Bracamontes confronted and fatally attacked Sacramento County Deputy Danny Oliver with a firearm. The rampage escalated into a multi-county pursuit, during which Bracamontes repeatedly fired weapons at law enforcement and stole vehicles to evade capture. The chaos ended in Auburn, California, when Bracamontes engaged in a second deadly encounter with police, slaying Placer County Deputy Mikuel Davis Jr. Throughout his trial, Bracamontes' disdain for authority was on full display. He laughed, smiled, and disrupted proceedings.
Intentionally and personally discharged a firearm, to wit, a 9mm handgun.
Despite the gravity of the slayings he committed, he appeared detached, consuming water and rocking in his chair as the jury deliberated. His behavior horrified jurors and spectators alike, who struggled to reconcile the severity of his crimes with his disturbing calmness. When the verdict was finally read, Bracamontes was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree homicide with special circumstances. During sentencing, he continued to flaunt his indifference, clapping and smiling at the family of Deputy Oliver as the judge imposed capital punishment. The court's decision finally brought a formal reckoning, yet Bracamontes' reaction left a lasting impression.
I will break out soon, and I will kill more.
Dexter Johnson. On October 9, 2013, Dexter Johnson carried out a calculated and brutal crime in Texas. Along with accomplices, he targeted a man connected to his girlfriend. The victim was restrained and forced to his knees as Johnson and the others surrounded him, taunting and threatening him while the situation spiraled out of control. What began as intimidation quickly escalated. Johnson then attacked the victim with a firearm, ending his life in what prosecutors would later describe as a cold-hearted slaying. In the days that followed, Johnson did not turn himself in. Law enforcement launched a search, tracking him for several days before finally locating him, hiding with his girlfriend in a wooded area. His arrest brought an end to a short but violent manhunt that left the community shaken. Over the next 2 years, the case moved through the Texas court system. Prosecutors built a capital punishment case, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the crime and the presence of accomplices. By 2015, Johnson stood trial. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury found him guilty. At sentencing, the courtroom was tense as the reality of the verdict set in. As the capital punishment was formally imposed, Johnson broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he looked toward his family. Then, in a sudden and explosive outburst, he grabbed a chair and hurled it across the courtroom, sending people scrambling and causing chaos in the room. Martez Abram. Martez Abram's violence erupted like an unstoppable storm, transforming an ordinary day in South Haven, Mississippi, into a scene of chaos and terror. It began with a routine workplace suspension at Walmart, where Abram had been reprimanded for showing a blade to a fellow employee. Hours later, he returned to the store armed with multiple weapons, his anger and intent unmistakable. That day, managers Anthony Brown and Brandon Gales were fatally wounded by gunfire, their lives cut short in the workplace they had served for years. As if the devastation were not enough, an officer who arrived on the scene was also fired upon, though survived due to the protection of a bulletproof vest. Abram then set a fire and attempted to flee, leaving behind a path of destruction, fear, and confusion that would haunt the community for months. In court, Abram was forced to confront the consequences of his actions in an unflinching way, compelled to watch footage of the attacks frame by frame, witnessing the full extent of the violence he had unleashed.
Stop. Mr. Gale is on the floor going down at this point, isn't he? Yes. Okay, and that's you shooting him, right? Yes.
He initially admitted to the crimes, acknowledging what had occurred, but soon tried to backtrack, claiming that his memory of the day was clouded by fear and confusion, as though the intensity of his own actions had been too much to retain. The jury deliberated quickly, fully aware of the unrelenting and deliberate nature of Abram's choices, and less than an hour later, the verdict was delivered, guilty on all counts. The judge imposed the ultimate legal consequence, sentencing Abram to capital punishment for each slaying, leaving no room for debate or mitigation. Throughout the proceedings, Abram remained chillingly composed, displaying no tremor, no tears, and no sign of remorse, a detached stillness that underscored the cold, calculated path he had chosen and the finality of the punishment now imposed upon him.
We, the jury, find the defendant Martez Abram guilty of attempted murder in count 3.
Nikko Jenkins.
The defendant's commission of these 4 murders over a 10-day period is one of the worst killing sprees in the history of this state.
Nikko Jenkins went back to the life of violence almost immediately after his release from prison on July 30th, 2013. Days later, Omaha would experience a wave of terror unlike anything the city had seen. On August 11th, a patrol officer stumbled upon a white Ford pickup parked near a city swimming pool. Inside, 2 victims lay cold, their heads showing signs of brutal trauma, a grisly scene that would haunt first responders. The nightmare didn't stop there. 10 days later, on August 21st, Andrea Kruger's remains were discovered along 168th and 4th Street. She had been wounded by firearm multiple times, her body abandoned in the early morning darkness. Jenkins eventually confessed in an 8-hour interrogation, revealing a chilling rationale. He claimed these acts were sacrifices to Apophis, an ancient Egyptian serpent god. His explanation added a disturbing layer of ritualistic horror to an already brutal spree. In court, Jenkins's conduct was as unsettling as his crimes. Representing himself, he howled, spoke in tongues, and shouted the names of his victims, creating a spectacle that many would never forget. Psychiatrists examined him and concluded that his apparent psychosis was feigned and a performance meant to manipulate the courtroom. By May 2017, the trial concluded and the judge delivered the ultimate sentence, capital punishment. Throughout the proceedings and the announcement of the verdict, Jenkins remained eerily still, his expression a haunting calm that belied the horror he had inflicted on Omaha. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, one of America's most infamous serial criminals, had already earned a chilling reputation by the time he faced his final court appearances. Throughout the 1970s, Bundy had eluded capture while abducting, inducing bodily harm, and taking the lives of young women across multiple states, leaving a trail of fear that stretched from Washington to Florida. His crimes were calculated, manipulative, and horrifyingly methodical, earning him the nickname the Charming Monster for his ability to disarm victims with his charisma. Bundy's capture came after years of investigation, culminating in his arrest in 1975. During the trials that followed, he appeared calm, almost theatrical, often using his charm to manipulate proceedings. He insisted on representing himself, a decision that allowed him to taunt and confuse the courtroom while maintaining a veneer of control. He even cross-examined witnesses, including the families of his victims, with cold precision. The Florida trial, in 1979, which focused on the brutal harming and slayings of several women at the Chi Omega sorority house in Gainesville, revealed the full scope of Bundy's violence. He had bludgeoned his victims with a crowbar, abducted them from familiar surroundings, and left their bodies in desolate locations. Courtroom evidence, photographs, and Bundy's own confessions left little doubt of his guilt. By January 24, 1989, the long wait for justice came to an end. Bundy was led into the Florida State Prison chamber, where capital punishment was to be carried out via electric chair.
This court, independent of, but in agreement with, the advisory sentence rendered by the jury, does hereby impose the death penalty upon the defendant Theodore Robert Bundy.
Witnesses watched as he remained composed to the final moments, his usual calm and controlled demeanor unwavering even as the executioner prepared. When the sentence was carried out, Bundy's life ended, awaiting a capital punishment, but the shadow of his crimes continued to haunt the families of his victims and the nation. His final reactions were almost eerily detached, reflecting the same cold calculation and chilling composure that had defined his life of crime. However, before the sentencing was done, Bundy claimed he had done nothing wrong.
I'm not asking for mercy, for I find it somewhat absurd to ask for mercy for something I did not do.
Dylann Roof. On June 17, 2015, a Bible study in Charleston, South Carolina, turned into a nightmare when 21-year-old Dylann Roof walked in and fatally wounded 9 worshippers with a firearm. Roof's victims included elderly congregants and a state senator, and the violence was intended to terrorize the black community and ignite racial conflict. He was apprehended the next day after fleeing the scene and confessed to the attack, revealing his extremist beliefs and manifestos tied to white supremacy. Roof's federal trial began in December 2016, where he faced 33 federal charges, including hate crimes, resulting in his passing. prosecutors presented harrowing evidence, including victim statements and Roof's own admissions. As the trial shifted into the sentencing phase in early 2017, Roof made the unsettling choice to represent himself, refusing to let attorneys present mitigating evidence that might spare his life. During the proceedings, family members repeatedly recounted the profound losses they endured, often reducing jurors to tears. Roof told the jury that he did not feel psychologically abnormal and refused to ask for leniency, even suggesting he still felt justified in his actions despite the immense suffering he caused. On January 10, 2017, after unanimous jury deliberations, Roof was sentenced to capital punishment under federal statute. In addition to the federal sentence, he later pled guilty to state charges and received 9 consecutive life terms without the possibility of release. Till the end, Dylann stayed chillingly calm as the judge gave his condolences to the victims' families.
I would also like to say to the victims, I'm awful sorry for your loss. It's a tremendous loss. It's a tremendous loss to the community, and there's just no way to explain it.
Richard Ramirez.
This trial is a joke.
In the mid-80s, Southern California was gripped by a wave of terror as Richard Ramirez carried out a brutal spree of home invasions, acts of violence, and deadly attacks that would come to define one of the most fearsome criminal chapters in recent U.S. history. Between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez broke into homes, fatally injured more than a dozen people, violated others, and terrorized entire neighborhoods, often leaving satanic symbols at crime scenes and instilling fear in the communities he targeted. His unpredictable violence earned him the monikers the Night Stalker and the Valley Intruder. After months of fear and an intensive manhunt, Ramirez was recognized by civilians at a crime scene and detained by residents before law enforcement arrived. Ultimately, the evidence against him was overwhelming. He faced multiple counts of first-degree homicide, attempted homicide, burglary, and misconduct offenses. In 1989, a California jury convicted Ramirez on dozens of felony counts, including 12 counts of first-degree homicide and numerous related offenses. He had terrorized both Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area, creating a lasting imprint of fear in one of the nation's largest metropolitan regions. The judge formally sentenced Ramirez to capital punishment in California's gas chamber, imposing the ultimate punishment for his spree of violence.
In count 32 of the information, fixed the penalty therefore at death.
Throughout his sentencing hearing, Ramirez's behavior was disturbingly erratic. He wore dark glasses, rocking in his chair, and grinning at spectators even as relatives of his victims recounted the pain he had inflicted. At times, he delivered rambling statements invoking occult and sinister imagery, demonstrating a chilling lack of remorse. Though Ramirez spent decades awaiting execution while his automatic appeals wound through the courts, he never left prison alive. He eventually passed away due to cancer in 2013 before the sentence could be carried out. Michael Madison, in the summer of 2013, East Cleveland, Ohio, was shaken by the discovery of the remains of 3 girls near a residential building. On July 19, 2013, responding officers found the decomposing remains of a woman inside a garage leased to Michael Madison, a registered offender living above a cable company's office. Within a day, 2 more deceased were located, one in a backyard and another in the basement of a vacant house nearby. All 3 victims, 18-year-old Sherelda Terry, 28-year-old Shatisha Sheely, and 38-year-old Angela Deskins, were identified by investigators in the days that followed. Soon authorities linked the discoveries to Madison's apartment area. Police obtained a search warrant and quickly found further evidence of decomposition inside Madison's living space, prompting a brief standoff at his mother's home before he was taken into custody on July 19th without further incident. He was swiftly charged with multiple counts of aggravated homicide, kidnapping, abusive acts, mutilation, and having a weapon while under a disability, with bail set at $6 million. When Madison's trial opened on April 4, 2016, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence tying him to the homicides, including his own admissions during police interviews. After less than a day of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on all counts on May 5, 2016. Just over 2 weeks later, on May 20, 2016, the jury recommended capital punishment, and on June 2, 2016, a Cuyahoga County judge formally sentenced Madison to capital punishment for the brutal slayings. During the sentencing hearing, Madison was seen smirking, a moment that sparked outrage. One victim's father even lunged at him in the courtroom before being restrained. As appeals progressed, the Ohio Supreme Court unanimously upheld his sentence in July 2020, affirming that the aggravated homicides and disposal of the victims in garbage bags warranted the harshest punishment. On March 2024, the court granted a stay of execution pending the resolution of all post-conviction proceedings and appeals, keeping Madison on at Ross Correctional Institution.
I am struck by the sheer inhumanity of what one human being could do to not one, but 3 human beings. It is incomprehensible.
Sega Edward Gillard. In December 2016, 27-year-old Sega Edward Gillard was involved in a deadly incident at the America's Best Value Inn in Raleigh, North Carolina. Security footage later shown at trial captured Gillard and an accomplice entering a motel hallway and confronting 2 people, 22-year-old April Lynn Holland, who was 3 months pregnant, and her 28-year-old partner, Dwayne Garvey. Later, Gillard and his accomplice fatally injured both of them during what prosecutors described as a violent confrontation that erupted during an attempted robbery. That footage became one of the central pieces of evidence linking Gillard to the fatal encounter. Police arrested Gillard in connection with the motel incident in late 2016, and he was charged with multiple serious counts, including 2 counts of first-degree homicide, attempted robbery with a firearm, and attempted first-degree misconduct. His trial took place in early 2019, and after deliberations, the jury found him guilty on all charges. When the trial moved to the punishment phase, the same panel of jurors weighed aggravating and mitigating factors. After deliberating for hours, the jury unanimously recommended capital punishment, the first such verdict by a Wake County jury in more than a decade. On March 4, 2019, the judge formally imposed 2 capital punishment sentences in Superior Court, Wake County. Throughout the sentencing hearing, victims' family members addressed the court, speaking about the impact of the passings on their lives. As the judge announced the capital punishment sentences, Gillard showed no visible emotion, remaining calm and detached even as the courtroom absorbed the gravity of the verdict against him. Wade Wilson. 30-year-old Wade Wilson unleashed a deadly spree in Cape Coral, Florida, that would soon grip the state in horror in 2019. Wilson's first victim, 35-year-old Christine Melton, was found asphyxiated in her own bed after meeting him the night before at a bar. Hours later, Wilson encountered 43-year-old Diane Ruiz, walking to work. He lured her into Melton's stolen car under false pretenses and then asphyxiated her before running her over multiple times. This was a grisly escalation in violence that underscored the brutality of his actions. Wilson then called his biological father and confessed to both slayings, and that tip led to his arrest the next day. Authorities later revealed Wilson's criminal history extended back years, including convictions for burglary, grand theft, battery, and firearms offenses. After the slayings, a Lee County grand jury indicted him on multiple charges, including first-degree homicide for each victim, along with burglary and other felonies. The prosecution presented evidence showing the slayings were not random accidents, but heinous, atrocious, and cruel, with the second homicide described as coldly premeditated. Jurors weighed the brutality and the suffering of the victims' families when they deliberated. On June 12, 2024, Wilson was convicted on all counts. The same jury that found him guilty later voted, by strong majorities, to recommend capital punishment for both crimes. Lee County Circuit Judge Nicholas Thompson upheld that recommendation. On August 27, 2024, in a packed courtroom, the judge formally imposed 2 capital punishments, ruling that the crimes met the strict legal standard for capital punishment. As the judge pronounced capital punishment, Wilson remained cold and expressionless, his face betraying none of the gravity of his fate. Charles Ng. Between 1985 and 1986, a gruesome spree unfolded across California and Nevada, leaving a trail of mutilated victims linked to a wandering drifter and his accomplice. Charles Ng, along with partner Leonard Lake, kidnapped men, women, and children, subjecting them to confinement, torture, and ultimately fatal violence at a secluded cabin in Calaveras County. The passing of their victims were brutal and methodical, with remains discovered, bound, disfigured, and hidden in barrels buried on the property. When Lake took his own life as authorities closed in, law enforcement unearthed a horrific archive of evidence. Nung fled to Canada but was eventually tracked down, extradited to the United States, and stood trial in California on multiple homicide charges. Unlike his partner, he faced trial again and again as each charge unfolded, each victim's story brought forward with painstaking detail by prosecutors determined to give their names back to history and deliver justice. The courtroom saw stacks of evidence, testimony from survivors, and dark recordings from the cabin that made it impossible to deny the sheer brutality of his actions. After hours of deliberation, a California jury convicted Ng on numerous counts of slayings, kidnapping, and related atrocities. During the sentencing phase, jurors weighed the horrors of the crimes, the bound victims, the videotaped violence, the deliberate cruelty, and concluded that only capital punishment could fit the magnitude of what had been done. In the end, Ng remained expressionless as the verdict and sentence were pronounced. There was no outburst and no plea for mercy, only a cold, silent acceptance. Timothy Jones Jr. In the late summer of 2014, 32-year-old Timothy Jones Jr. committed one of the most horrific family homicides in recent American history. On August 28th, he fatally injured his 5 children: Mera, 8, Elias, 7, Nathan, 6, Gabriel, 2, and Abigail, only 1, inside their mobile home in Lexington County, South Carolina. In the days that followed, Jones drove with their bodies wrapped in trash bags across multiple states before disposing of them along a rural Alabama road. Investigators later arrested him in Mississippi after noticing chemical odors and blood-soaked interior in his vehicle. Jones initially tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, but the court rejected this argument. As the trial progressed in 2019, jurors were presented with harrowing evidence of the slayings and Jones's chilling behaviors before and after the incidents. Prosecutors argued that his actions were calculated and deliberate. Family members and experts took the stand, recounting the devastating loss and the emotional toll it had taken on relatives and first responders alike. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Jones on 5 counts of homicide. During the sentencing phase, which he faced in the same year, jurors swiftly recommended the harshest penalty under South Carolina law, capital punishment. The South Carolina Supreme Court later upheld his conviction and sentence, affirming that the evidence left no reasonable doubt about the brutality and intent behind his crimes. When capital punishment was imposed, Jones remained stoic, absorbing the full weight of the judgment against him.
Now recommend to the court that the defendant, Timothy R. Jones, Jr., be sentenced to death.
Lonnie Franklin Jr. From the mid-80s to 2007, Lonnie Franklin Jr. terrorized South Los Angeles with a pattern of violence that went undetected for decades. Known as the Grim Sleeper, Franklin was ultimately linked to at least 10 homicides and 1 attempted slaying of women and 1 teenage girl, with suspected additional victims as investigations unfolded. Over time, he preyed largely on vulnerable women, many of whom were found fatally wounded and discarded in alleys or trash bins. Advances in forensic science and a re-examination of cold cases led to his arrest in July 2010. In 2016, a Los Angeles jury convicted Franklin on 10 counts of first-degree homicide, each with special circumstances. During the penalty phase of the trial, prosecutors urged jurors to impose the ultimate penalty, arguing his actions were calculated, demeaning, and revealed a long-term pattern of predation. Despite a defense team's request for life without parole, the jury concluded that the severity and duration of the slayings warranted capital punishments on all counts. Franklin's decades-long evasion of capture and the breadth of his crimes made this one of the most notorious serial homicide cases in California's history. His victims' families wept as the verdicts were read, confronting decades of unanswered questions and pain. When the sentence was finally read to him, though, Franklin sat quietly, emotionless and staring straight ahead.
Lonnie Franklin Jr. for the first-degree murder of Deborah Jackson as alleged in count 1 and the special circumstance of multiple murder. It is the judgment and sentence of this court that you shall suffer the death penalty.